Welcome back, everyone, to another week of the Parisi Podcast. It is your host, Coach Casey Lee here, back at the home base. And we have an awesome question that was asked to us in All Access. So if you're just listening, or if you're just tuning in the new year, maybe you found the Parisi Podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you're finding podcasts. We are on all platforms. Shameless plug. We had a great question asked by one of our coaches in All Access, new member. He said, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on here. What's up with the research reviews? Let me take a step back. If you don't know, All Access is our monthly education site. I'll say that, education site, where we put up every month, at the beginning of every month, about, I'll say, half a dozen content pieces, ranging from short form, like under 5-minute, videos about coaching cues or just different coaching, we call it Coach's Eye, different coaching things that we see or questions we get asked from our members, all the way up to master classes and webinars. We actually put all of the master classes and webinars that we release publicly in All Access first. So All Access sees it first. It's kind of our review, and then whatever people really like in All Access, we think people will really like it all over the place. And then one of the other things that we do is every month we release 2 research reviews. And it's kind of, I don't want to say it's like on the back burner for a lot of our coaches, but I think a lot of coaches join All Access or get involved with the Parisi Speed School education because of our programming masterclasses, our different webinars, where we go a little deeper on topics. But I felt when we were creating All Access that having a reputable source, I don't want to say an end-all be-all, but having someone who's in the industry goes through the latest research, whether it be from the NSCA Strength Conditioning journals, Google Scholar, PubMed, different levels of neuroscience or exercise rehab journals that kind of bridge into how exercise and sports performance or how it can be applicable at certain times. Have someone just cipher through those and just scroll through those different researches that come out and just say, hey, here's what is new, here's what's happening, etc. And this coach asked, what's up with the research? Not something that I thought was in here, but we release 2 different research reviews every month, and it's going on 3 years now. So there's a lot of different reviews. We have them organized by strength, speed, and nutrition. So these are all different topics, wide variety of topics. But it got me thinking, and it was a great question to talk about how we use research in strength and conditioning. Long-winded way to say this is going to be a 2-part podcast series on how we use research in strength conditioning, specifically we as meaning in Parisi land, or as a performance coach, how you can utilize research. We actually did a podcast way back, kind of the first rendition, I guess, of the Parisi Podcast with Seth Foreman. I'll make sure that is linked in the show notes as well, because that was a really good episode, deep in the archives. Seth is one of those coaches who just has that memory, and he can just tell you exactly the year and what research, who the researcher was, and be like, well, in this huge, groundbreaking research study in 1997, we found this and that, this and that. And he's a wealth of knowledge. And it was an awesome podcast episode just talking about how he utilizes research and how coaches can utilize research. But I felt like it was a very important piece to add to our education site, because a lot of our education in podcast land, right? If you're listening to other strength conditioning podcasts, it's a lot about experience and a lot of anecdotal interactions. Well, this worked for me because of this, or this is the training system we've used and we've tried it with this many athletes, right? Like Parisi is a great example, 30 years of working with athletes. This is what we have found that works really well. And then here's how we utilize research to update things along the way. And we talk about those. But what I thought was important, and this was something that really helped me. So there's a little bit of bias, but through my 20s, I would do what I call Sunday reading. And every morning, I would find or have bookmarked or saved or emailed myself, depending on when and how, research articles that I thought were relevant to different topics that I either didn't know or found just interesting on the pure headline of the research. And every Sunday for an hour, I would read research. And what was funny, looking back at it, is a lot of times I would spend time highlighting words that I didn't know and looking them up, because if you read research, it can be very dense. I think it's a completely different side to exercise science and kinesiology and sports performance and sports science. At the time, this is again in the early 2010s, sports science was becoming more mainstream, but it was still relatively just different, just kind of like hidden. I'll say like kind of the hidden realm of sports performance. And it was one of those things that I found really useful for me, not only because it helped me and forced me to learn different terms of the industry, different research methods in the industry, what different tools were behind the scenes in science, and then also just interpret the data to what I found could be useful. And some of it was not useful at all. Some of it was bunk research or was something that we thought was true. And then, now looking back 10 years later, 15 years later, it's not, right? So we know science doesn't necessarily change, but as technology advances, we find that what we originally thought in one type of study maybe didn't tell the whole story. So science is very rarely, in my opinion, ever wrong. But I think what changes is the depth of the study, the depth of the understanding, and then different changes based off of other interventions. So I liken the analogy, like talking to Ken Clark, the great Dr. Ken Clark, about ground contact times, shin angles, and just what really mattered when you're coaching athletes of different shin positions, whatever it might be, how their foot interacts with the ground. I remember asking him this in one of our Q&As in our sports performance mentorship, saying like, does it really matter? And what he found was that the research says, yes, it does matter, but on the list of things, because other research has come out saying, well, maybe we need to really work on contract relax reflexes in the body to enhance sprint performance, or maybe we need to look at angular thigh velocity for the leg as it swipes up and down. So yes, it matters, but because more research has come out, we have now dubbed it that other things may matter more. So I hope that is used as an example of how research can play a role in for a performance coach of saying, yes, it's important, but we now know other things may be more important or just be higher on the list of things that we as coaches need to have physical interventions with or train to a more greater extent. So I want that to be an example of just how research can change. But I wanted to take this first part of the podcast to talk about how, and I do have notes here. So if you're listening to this, you'll never see the notes. But if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see me look down. You probably see some papers brush up here because I wanted to make sure I did the due diligence in this podcast, because I think in today's world, there's kind of a divide, right? And I don't want to be an absolutist here, because you'll hear me say absolutism is not great in sports performance, but there seems to be a divide between the evidence-based coaches and the practical application-based coaches. And I think that there's both bring a lot to the table, but the really good and the really good sports performance coaches that have been in the industry for a long time, that have the staying power, find a way to appreciate both. And that's something that I really respect about guys like Steve Leo, guys that I respect about Bill Parisi. These guys have the coaching hours, but they also have the understanding of the science. And it's important to respect both. And I will go into examples of that here shortly. But the point of this isn't to make the side and say, well, evidence-based research, evidence-based coaching is bunk and it's only for those that live in a lab and it's great if you have force plates. And that's not the point of this podcast. Likewise, it's not to say, well, if you have coaching and sound systems and you can implement those with the athletes. I'm not trying to say that either. So we need to understand and respect both. And I want to share how we do it, how I've done it, and how we actually help coaches through our training certifications do the same thing. And the coaches of All Access, because every month they get to read 2 different research reviews. Some are, mix of some nutrition, some strength, some speed, because it all really matters as far as what we do. But I will say that, so I got some notes here. So if you see me look down, it's because I want to make sure I got the notes dialed. Okay, I organized my thoughts because they can get a little crazy talking to a camera. Can get a little crazy. Okay, so that's the origin of All Access and our research reviews. But how I've presented it to coaches in the past is that research is like a North Star. It's something you can look up and you can see it. It's always going to be there. However, your practical coaching is like the tangible map that you would use to get from point A to point B. Now, if you ever kind of got screwed up, you can always look up and see the North Star and say, hey, okay, we got to go in that direction. But they both can exist independently of each other. You can have a map and still get from point A to point B, and then you can look up at the North Star and still figure out where you're trying to go, right? North, east, southwest, based off the bearings of the North Star ahead of you. They both can exist independently, but they do work well collaboratively. So for us as coaches, I think it's really important that, and this is where I think you can have a benefit if you're in a specific niche. If you work with a specific population, right, you can get very singular with the research that you want to understand. I'll always remember listening to Eric Cressey talk. Eric Cressey is the president and founder of Cressey Sports Performance. If you don't know who he is, climb out from under the rock. He's like the baseball guy, and has been for decades now. But you go watch Eric present, and he brings up very relevant research about elbow, shoulder, and rotational mechanics because he trains baseball players. And he is the baseball guy, but he also understands the joint complexity of the elbow and the shoulder and trunk rotation, as well as anyone, I think, in the world. So if you're in a specific niche, it can do a great job of just making your research efforts singularly focused. If you're a Gen Pop trainer, you work with a variety of athletes. Again, your singular niche might be speed training. It might be change of direction, or it might just be how that population was studied. If it's adolescent soccer players, if it's graduate level basketball players, if it's professional athletes, whatever it may be, the population may be something of a singular focus. So you do have those advantages with research when you're looking. You can find the singular population, you can find the singular age range, or you can find the singular discipline that might be relevant to you as a coach. So I think that is an advantage because that's the North Star effect. We can go and find and say, hey, I need to find more information about how creatine impacts strength athletes or how creatine can impact sprinters. Or I do speed training and I need to know more about how the thigh limb velocity impacts sprinting. There's research out there in 2026. There's research out there that you can absolutely find. So where do you find the research? You find the research the easiest way, and it's free to get started, which is nice, is you go to Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a Google search engine that is going to sift through all major research publication entities throughout a variety of different countries. Now, where you will get held up is some articles are fully free. Some articles only give you the abstract. What I've done in the past, and this has worked, is if you find an article that you're very interested in, you can email the author, introduce yourself, and ask and say, hi, I am so-and-so. I'm a sports performance coach. I see you have a published article through blank publication. Congratulations on being published. I'm looking to learn more about insert relevant topic here. And I'm wondering if I can get access to your article for free. It's behind a paywall. I have no way of subscribing to insert random journal here, whether it be a professional membership that you're not either financially, it's not financially viable for me at this time. Am I able to be granted access? And a lot of times that author will send you the PDF back. It might not be fast, but it does happen, right? And that's how I would get access to these different articles and just kind of, I'll say, slum my way in. And then I eventually became a certified strength conditioning coach in the NSCA, and I had my membership and I paid extra for the journals. I think it was like $15 a year or something at the time. You can get them digitally in print, whatever. And then I would have the research mailed to me and it was super awesome. But before I even knew that there was research associated with different memberships, I would just email the author and I would say, here, it's PMID, this number, like I'm hoping that I'm able to get access. Are you able to help me out? And a lot of times they would just reply back and copy the PDF of the article. So you can get access there. But the other thing is you will find full text or scanned PDF copies available on Google Scholar, which is super useful. There's also a bunch of different search filters. So you can search by year. You can search from a year or before a year. You can filter by free text. You can filter by researcher, if you know the researcher. But typically what I do when I sit down for all access or to review research now, I go to Google Scholar, I type in 2 keywords that I'm interested in, creatine and sprinting, squat max and change of direction. And I just start there with 2 keywords, always separated by the word and. That is important. If you're familiar with search engines, you need to have those keywords. Sometimes I'll put them in parentheses or in quotes, but that doesn't necessarily change it too much because I'm looking for that broad spectrum of research to show up. And then from there, you can toggle on the, like I believe it's going to be on the left side of the screen. You can toggle and filter by year. I'm a big proponent of filtering from 2020 and earlier because I believe the greatest thing that has happened to our industry of sports performance was COVID. The reasoning there is because there's a couple of reasons, but the big one as it applies to this topic is that a bunch of the lab guys and gals were locked in their labs, not talking to anyone, and they just conducted research, and they just grinded away with research because you could be away from people in private. You can review it in private. You can submit it in private. It's awesome. And there's a ton of research that has come out of labs since 2020. So I'm a big proponent of filtering. And also, I mean, now in 2026, as we record this, that means that it's relevant within the last half decade or so. And I think that's really important because it's not to say that research from outside of 15 or 20 years is irrelevant. A lot of times, those past studies have been brought into meta studies for further analysis because we've had technological advancements. So they're often included in a lot of meta reviews or these large population studies where we'll take this thesis from this research cited by this person in 1987, and now we have better ultrasounds or EMG systems so we can see better muscle contractions, etc. So I think that it's kind of the golden age, so to speak, of research and science-based coaching in 2026. So that is how and where you can find research and to really, again, make it that North Star effect. The other thing that I like to bring up to just like coaching practices, but bring up to other coaches when we talk about the value of research is that it's meant to be challenged. And it's not necessarily meant to be challenged in a way of saying it's wrong because I think it's pretty binary, right? The results show what the results show. It's either significant or it's insignificant as far as the findings go. But what's really valuable is that we can say, okay, I know the research says that for maximum strength potential, athletes need to rest 5 to 6 minutes between sets when they're working at blank percentage. But in a 60-minute training session with athletes, I don't know if we have the practical time to do that. So where can we make some concessions or some collaborative efforts of like what's going to actually practically work in a 60-minute sessions with athletes? And the NSCA did a study on this where I believe this is was a big groundbreaking study when it happened. I want to say it was in 2019. Yeah, 2019-ish. Where they researched that you have about an 80% restoration of creatine phosphate in your muscles after 2 minutes of static rest. So it was huge because it was published by the NSCA because we know in a practical sense, we can't always wait 6 minutes, 5 minutes between sets, but we can often do 2 minutes, especially as we cycle athletes through in a pod style format. So later we'll have to do a podcast on how we structure team training, but that's where a lot of like the 2-minute rest between strength sets has really come from, is this research. So it was very useful to really combine the practical needs to the research showing. So it's not that it was challenged, but it's how they can work collaboratively. Again, like they can be independent of each other, but they work best practical and science-based, evidence-based, if you will, how they can work collaboratively. So it's meant to be challenged. It's not necessarily like, this is the way it has to be done. Well, let's look at it from the other lens, right? Let's understand what the research says, but then let's understand when I have the athletes or the teams in front of me, how I have to present certain things. And then we need to look at what we want from the research. And I think this is really important because a lot of times coaches will read and be like, well, I thought the research showed this. Well, was that what you were looking for? Or are you looking to validate a belief that you already have? My personal background is in stats and analytics. That's what my college degree, like concentration, was in. So I've learned that you can make numbers and research kind of validate anything you want if worded and phrased correctly, or if the testing procedures are going to biasly show those results. But when I write the research review, I look for 6 different categories. Number 1 is, what is the research? What's the thesis? What is the point of the research? Because a lot of times the point of the research may not even be applicable. You might see the title and be like, oh yeah, that sounds really good. And then you look at the thesis of what they were actually trying to study, and you might go, well, yeah, you lost me there. And I think that's the nice thing about research, because you don't have to necessarily read too far. You can get into like the second sentence of an abstract and understand that, oh, this isn't really what I thought it was going to be. And you can move on to the next one. So it's not like reading a book where you have to read half of it to decide if you like it. You really just have to read 2 sentences and then decide if it's worthwhile for you. And it might be, it might not be. So that's number 1. What does the research say? What is the thesis? Number 2 is, how did they do the study? Is it a randomized population study? Was it a control group to a placebo group? What was the study? How were they doing it? And that kind of segues into the third point, is who were they studying? So for us as sports performance coaches, typically if I see that the study was done in the age population of what we would see at a Parisi speed school, right, from adolescents, say like 10, 12, all the way up to about college athletes, but really we like that high school genre, like 18 and under, is going to be more relevant, but we will look at college studies too. Who and how were they studied? Because a lot of times in a graduate lab, they're using graduate students. And it's not to say that that's not applicable, but the force output of a 24-year-old male or female is going to have different capabilities than the force output of a 12-year-old. And it's not that the research is bad if it's with an older individual or group. It's just not necessarily something you can't just look at it and say, well, if it works for them, it's going to work for this population. We can't necessarily infer that. So that is the tough part. And typically when I look, I want to bias population studies that are done with populations that we would actually see in a youth sports performance setting. And then the fourth thing is the outcomes, and understanding what the outcomes are. And again, those are going to show that, hey, we're trying to test the squat max, an athlete's maximum squat relative to their vertical jump performance. We may find that it is significant that their squat max, the higher the squat max, the better the vert, or it's insignificant. The higher the squat max, the better the vert. That's what we're looking for. And that's basically going to tell us, does this characteristic matter towards this outcome? And I think when we look at the North Star effect for coaches, that's really important. It's really important because if you're a coach and you're trying to learn more about a population or a niche or a skill set, that you can now start to help decipher, utilizing research, some of the mainstream stuff that you see that's thrown in front of us in social media or in courses or in lectures, clinics, and go, yeah, this makes sense, this tracks. Or actually, I've seen in research this outcome. What are your thoughts on that in a practical setting? And this is where I feel very fortunate that we go to like a Parisi seminar and you get the friends of Parisi. You've seen them across our Instagram pages and in All Access, guys like Michelle Dalcour, guys like Bobby Stroop, or ladies like Sue Falsoni. These are people who are very well educated in the industry. So if you say something like, well, I've seen research that shows other, what are your thoughts on that? They might be able to either, 1, point out something you missed, or 2, just take a more realistic approach and say, yes, that absolutely works if you have this scenario in front of you. But if you're seeing this type of scenario, the research now starts to skew a little off, and maybe we need to adjust the outcomes a little differently for this group over here, right? That may work for a 16-year-old that has a base of strength, a training age, but this 16-year-old or those with a lower training age, it may not have the same type of effect. So it's a great conversation starter with different professionals and industry leaders, because they, again, are very well researched on a lot of these topics that they present on. So I know, like, if like talking to Ken Clark or Steve Leo or Bill Parisi about speed training, like they can tell you, like, yeah, we've seen research. We've also seen this practical component. Here's how they both blend, right? Here's how we can utilize the research, how we have, but then here's where we've seen it didn't really work with, I think the best one that stands out to me is Steve Leo's presentation on sprint mechanics for a field sport athlete versus sprint mechanics for a sprinter, right? Both sprinting, but the environment changes depending on, or the needs of the environment will dictate what the athlete is going to do mechanically. So though we know this is how it should happen, textbook, evidence-based. But when you've got a football player running through the A gap, they have to have their head up. It's going to change their shin angle because of the way the demands of the sport look at it. So we know on paper, practically, yes, this is what a running back is going to look like. This is what a sprinter is going to look like coming out of the blocks. They're both going to be sprinting in the very literal sense, but they're going to have differences based off of the environmental needs, and the research might not be able to show that necessary difference, right? So this is kind of just an example again of how the outcomes can differ versus real life. And then the last two I think are really important. Is one, what are the conflicts? So I just put something up in our Assess and Correct about why we don't necessarily do weighted arm action. And the reason we don't necessarily do weighted arm action is there was a research study that was published and it had a huge conflict. It was basically funded by a loaded, I don't even know, it was not bands, but wrist weights, but it was some type of special wrist weight, right? I don't exactly remember the name of it right now, but it was some type of special wrist loaded resistance. And the company sponsored this study, and the lead researcher worked for that company. So that's a huge conflict that was disclosed in the research. So it's important to read who funded the research, any sort of affiliations, financial outcomes that a researcher may have. In this case, there was a significant researcher that had a significant financial advantage in this. And so that research, when I saw that, I was like, oh, weighted arm action, this could be a great research review. And I saw that and I was like, oh, you know what? We're not going to use this for our research review this month, but it shows a great example of maybe why we don't do weighted arm action per se, because the results, it was that it didn't really help at all. It was very insignificant. It actually altered the kinematics of the arm swing. Whereas, quick aside, we can use weighted arm action for an athlete to change environmental cues. But as far as speeding up arm action, it's very insignificant, not actually something that's overly useful, at least with a fixed added resistance. Making someone's arms heavier, turns out, does not help improve their arm action. Now, could they do research and say we had something that helped overspeed and enhance the neurological stimulus? That would be interesting in research, right? So kind of an example there of how it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but now we can kind of infer, well, maybe because it was a fixed resistance, maybe more dynamic assistance could improve arm action. Could be a very interesting research study. So again, just talking out loud, how it can absolutely make a difference in performance coaches looking to enhance performance, but also how they could use the research to maybe guide their training principles in their actual coaching practice. So always looking at the conflicts is going to be an important part to looking at research. And then the last one is, what is the actual application to a coaching practice? How would a coach take these results and be able to implement them into their practice? And that is something that the last section in our research reviews is, hey coach, here's how you would take this research study and apply it. And sometimes the research is just to say, you know what? This validates why we do not do something. And that can be incredibly useful for coaches, especially if they're trying to learn or better understand a training population or a training skill. So again, I do think research helps guide. It is the North Star effect to a lot of what our performance coaches need and can utilize. But make no mistake about it, it can lack in the practical component because it's a very controlled environment, as it should be. The more chaos in a research environment, the more bunk the research is going to be in something that we don't want. So it's a very controlled environment where they're really looking at that one desired, or I'll say one outcome to one thesis, right? This is what we saw and it was significant to the thesis, or this is what we saw and it was insignificant to the thesis. So that is something that when you look at the research, you want to run through those 6 different categories. And the last thing I'll say on this before we move into part 2 next week is that there's a lot of social media and what we'll call certainty culture, right? Where we can say, and there's a certain major individual in the sports performance industry that likes to come out and say, with heavy practical experience, this is what we do, and it's the way to do it because I've trained real athletes for 50 years. That's great. But what is very scary, and this is something that we find just as a whole in the industry is when someone says this is the way to do it, and it has to be this absolutist, certain with most certainty, it's very scary because it really does diminish and downplay a lot of the individuality that happens with working with athletes. So again, we look at a sprinter versus a running back. Those two need to sprint two different ways, or they should be sprinting essentially two different ways. There's non-negotiables that are going to occur as far as an improvement in ground contact time, limb velocity, vertical propulsion, for sure. Those things, those qualities, those stay. But as far as the technique and the style, the aesthetics of the movements, those are going to look very different. So if you're over here saying, or if you're someone, or you're seeing it, this is how we have to do it, this, that, and the other way, I just sometimes worry that is the wrong presentation, and we can utilize research to help guide the BS meter, which is an awesome question. If you've listened to this podcast, you've heard me ask some guests, like, how do you decipher through the BS? Like, how do you find the information that works and the information that sticks? Because there's a lot of information out there, some of it good, some of it bad. I think whether it's good or bad, it can be useful, but you have to start to internalize your own BS meter, and understanding the science-backed research is a great way to do that. So really watch out for the certainty, like the certainty chase, people who present themselves, because we have it thrown in front of us. If you're like me, you're close to the research, you love seeing different clips about athletic performance, you love to hear different coaches talk about how they're training athletes and get different ideas and explore different concepts, but just watch out when it comes to people who are overly certain about certain things. And then it can alter the reality check, right? Like if we're just really drawn to this one topic, this one conversation, this one piece of outcome, like there's a lot of high emotional attachment to that. And it can absolutely affect our athletes' buy-ins. If we're trying to say, this is what you're doing, this is what I know works, we need to change everything. That might not be the best way to present something to an athlete. Again, with the high level of individuality in athletes and sports and the different levels, if you're working with someone one-on-one versus a team, the level of conversation you can have with them, it's just different. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 episodes ago, I did a what's hot and what's not in 2026. And the topic of coming up with talking to sports performance coaches is one of those things where if a sports performance coach goes up to a sport coach and is like, hey coach, everything you believe is wrong, whether you're right or wrong, coach, you're going to really ruffle some feathers with the actual coach. So understanding research, asking them where they've found research or why that's something that they believe in is huge, because you're always looking to learn more, especially about the team or the sport that you're trying to train. It can be a great conversation starter, and it can be a great common ground for a performance coach talking to a sport coach. So dive into the research. Don't be afraid of it. And I really do think that it's important for performance coaches to spend some time, even if it's just one article a week. That would be 52 articles a year. That's pretty crazy. So we release 2 every month in all access. That's 24. So 2 a month. So that's 24 different research reviews that someone would read that would span nutrition, speed, and strength. So I think it's pretty phenomenal. And I think that alone is going to really enhance your understandings of different things and topics. And I say things like research study, like the tech behind it, the science behind it, but also really help further your understanding of certain disciplines or certain speed programming or protocols, or why protocols are the way they are. And we spell all that out. So is it a little bit of a shameless plug for All Access? Yeah, totally. I mean, it's all Parisi. You're listening to the Parisi Podcast, Parisi All Access. But also, it was a great question by the coach saying, hey, why do I care? This is something that I'm happy is here, but like I didn't know I needed this. Why do I need this? So number one, where research helps. Stay tuned for next week, because we're going to talk about how to translate the science and how you can really take that into the practical coaching practice that you do day in and day out. It's Coach Casey Lee signing out. Until next week.